Matthean priority, sometimes pronounced Matthean priority, is the view that Matthew was the first of the Synoptic Gospels written. In the previous video, we considered Markan priority, the view that Mark was first, and we found that each of the major arguments was circular or reversible or both. In this video, we will make a case that Matthean priority is the best explanation of the evidence. We'll look at 3 major arguments, 3 minor arguments, and an abductive argument. Major argument number 1, the argument from order. We've danced around this one a few times in previous videos, now it's time to dive in. New Testament scholars have divided the Gospels up into what they call pericopes, or freestanding segments of text, often just a few verses, which you could pick up and move somewhere else and you'd keep the whole story. In order to cut down on the jargon, I will be very loosely referring to pericopes as stories in this video. The argument from order looks at the order in which these stories are presented. This is not to take a position on what's the correct order, and Jesus almost certainly would have told the same stories more than once, and none of the synoptic authors appear to have any desire to present their material in a strictly chronological order. The question rather is, if we see 2 Gospels presenting a lot of material in the same order, can we make a case that one is borrowing from the other? For years, the argument from order was a mainstay of Markan priority, perhaps most notably documented by B.H. Streeter in the 1920s. In his work on Markan priority, he used the argument from order as a foundational piece of his case that Mark was written first. There were several patterns he drew attention to. For example, Matthew and Mark will often have their material in the same order and Luke's order is different. That's called Matthew and Mark agreeing against Luke. There are also a number of occasions where Mark and Luke will have their material in the same order and Matthew's different. That's called Mark and Luke agreeing against Matthew. But Matthew and Luke never agree in order against Mark. Streeter said this is clear and compelling evidence that Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke are using Mark's order. And where there's no Mark to follow, they go their separate ways. Now this isn't quite right, because not only do Matthew and Luke frequently depart from Mark's order even when there is Mark to follow, but there are actually cases where there is no Mark to follow, just material that's shared by Matthew and Luke, and they have the same order sometimes. So I do think Streeter slightly overplayed the evidence, but his case was considered compelling at the time. Then, in the 1950s, B.C. Butler dismantled this argument with a trenchant criticism in which he referred to Streeter's conclusions based on the argument from order as a schoolboyish error in logical reasoning. He made a very simple analogy. Imagine you've got 3 students sitting next to each other in a line. We'll say their names are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew writes something on his paper. Then Mark looks over Matthew's shoulder and copies, but he changes up the order a little bit. Then Luke looks over Mark's shoulder and copies from Mark. He keeps Mark's order, but he adds some content. This is by no means a metaphor for all of the data in the Synoptic Problem. It's just specifically looking at the argument from order and why Streeter's conclusion doesn't work. Because in this case, Luke and Matthew will never agree in order against Mark, not because Mark was first, Matthew was first in this case, but because Luke copied Mark's order. What Butler demonstrated is that Streeter's own data are consistent with any possible arrangement of the first 3 Gospels. If we stopped the argument right there, we would have to say the argument from order doesn't tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels were written. But there's another layer of data. Butler did not pursue it in great detail, largely because the Catholic Church didn't want him to. But later scholars, like Farmer, Orchard, Peabody, and others, did, and it changed the face of synoptic studies. This is the argument that when it clicked for William Farmer, it changed his career. This is the argument that when it clicked for me, the synoptic problem came into focus. It will be helpful to display this pictorially. We'll use blue for Matthew, black for Mark, and red for Luke. Let's start with Streeter's assumption. Let's say this is the order in which the Gospel of Mark is written. Then Matthew comes along. Sometimes he follows Mark's order. Sometimes he goes off and does his own thing. Sometimes he follows Mark's order. Sometimes he goes and does his own thing. Sometimes he follows Mark, and so on. Based on this data alone, we can't actually conclude anything about the order in which the Gospels are written. We could just flip this around and say we think it was Matthew's order that was original, and it's Mark that's going back and forth. Enter Luke. You see, Luke also sometimes does his own thing and sometimes follows Mark's order. This is not to scale, and it does draw attention to the fact that there are cases where all three Gospels do have the same order. We're going to consider these two cases separately. You'll actually find them interspersed throughout the Gospel of Mark, cases where they all agree on order and cases where they have this alternating pattern. This doesn't tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels are written. This is also compatible with any possible arrangement. But this material does. A pattern we see over and over again, particularly in the first half of Mark. Matthew will agree with Mark's order. And then where Matthew stops agreeing with Mark, Luke starts agreeing with Mark. Then where Luke stops agreeing with Mark, that's right where Matthew picks up and starts agreeing with Mark. Back and forth. What's going on here? Why are they taking turns following Mark's order? Why are they so focused on, I need to follow Mark when the other author didn't, but they're ambivalent about it when the other author did? Did Luke say, okay, I like following Mark's order and I'll follow him a lot, except when Matthew did? Do I really have to follow what Matthew did? So maybe if I really have to, sometimes I'll follow Mark's order still, even if Matthew did, but often I won't. Or did Matthew and Luke get together and say, hey, you writing a gospel? Yeah, me too. Okay, well, let's make for darn sure, whatever else we do, that at least one of us is always following Mark's order. Heaven knows why that's important, but let's make sure we do it. So Matthew says, okay, I'll follow Mark here, so you can go off and do your own thing. But I need you to have my back, because I've got something special planned over here, and I need you to follow Mark during this section. And Luke says, okay, that's fine, but don't leave me with this. You better come back, because I'm going to do something else over here. I'm not going to follow Mark's order here, so you need to. What's going on here? This is what David Barrett Peabody pithily referred to as they neatly divided Mark's gospel between them. This is a real problem for the two-source hypothesis that suggests that neither Matthew knew Luke's gospel nor Luke knew Matthew's, meaning this pattern would had to have emerged entirely by accident. I suggest this is wildly implausible. But even if one or both authors did intentionally put this pattern into their gospel, why in the world would they do it? Why add a mountain of complexity to the already complex, to say nothing of expensive, process of writing a gospel? Why put so much effort into developing a pattern that, for all they knew, nobody was ever going to see? We cannot infer that they knew at the time of writing these documents that all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were going to survive for centuries, because this pattern only shows up if you've got all three. And we cannot infer that they knew that at some future date, the Gospels were going to be compiled into a set, along with John, who has nothing to do with this order, and that these documents would be sent all around the world as a set, and they would be the most widely compared and studied documents in human history. We can't infer any of that knowledge back on them. Why would they go to such lengths to create this pattern? Why would they add a mountain to their workload? A pattern that's going to be obscured by all the non-Markan data they include anyway. And if it were so important to them, if it were such a foundational issue to get this pattern, then why did they mess it up? There are actually instances where all three Gospels disagree in order. Not very many, but if they cared so much about it, well, they dropped the ball. They didn't actually quite execute on it. To suggest that the Gospel authors were putting in some kind of code or riddle that you would only be able to find if you had all three Gospels and you subtracted out the non-Markan material, this is the stuff of conspiracy theories. We can study these Gospels and see the themes and structure with which they're put together. There is a clear structure to the Gospel of Matthew. There's a clear structure to the Gospel of Luke, and it has nothing to do with this pattern. I suggest we don't have any good reason to impose this structure upon the intentions of the authors when they haven't given us any reason to believe it's important to them, and there's no discernible theological value to it either. It would be irrational for Matthew and Luke to have done this on purpose, and it would be implausible for them to have done it by accident. Then how does this remarkable pattern emerge? Remember, we started this diagram with the assumption that Mark's gospel was written first. Let's walk back that assumption and try a different one. There's no need to try to explain an extraordinarily complex solution when there is a much, much, much simpler solution available. Let's imagine that Matthew is written first. Here's Matthew's order. Luke comes along. Most of the time he doesn't follow Matthew's order, but occasionally he does. Again, this is not to scale. These two instances are interspersed, but we're going to consider them separately to see how Mark responds in each case. When Matthew and Luke agree in order, Mark follows their order 100% of the time. Where Matthew and Luke have the same order and Mark chooses to include that story in his gospel, Mark follows Matthew and Luke's order 100% of the time. You rarely get 100% on anything in a study of ancient history, and here we've got one. And what about when they don't agree in order? Well, then he can't follow both of them. What Mark does, he follows Matthew for a bit. He follows Luke for a bit. Okay, I like the order that Matthew put those several stories in, I'll follow that. And then Luke's got that same story, and then after that he's got a really nice sequence, I'll follow Luke for a bit. He alternates between his sources. A very sensible thing to do if you're drawing material from two different sources. And so rather than a much more complex arrangement, trying to figure out how they did this and how they knew when one was going to start and one was going to stop following Mark, we've got a very clean and simple solution here. Where Mark's sources agree in order, he follows their order. Where they don't agree in order, he necessarily cannot follow both of them, and so he chooses one or the other. Mark's method makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider that his sources are written on scrolls that aren't broken down by chapter and verse. How do you find what you're looking for on a scroll? It's very helpful to know the order of the contents. So you find a story, okay, yeah, the one I'm looking for is 3 stories after that, or it's the story right before this. And so what I see in Mark is he's very familiar with the contents of Matthew and Luke. If somebody had preached regularly using these documents as sources, they would be familiar with the order. And so Mark takes some of the order from Matthew and he takes some of the order from Luke. As Harold Riley pointed out, there is a clear process by which Mark draws material as he works his way through Matthew and through Luke. But we cannot make that same argument if it's the other way around and Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke are drawing material from Mark. Rather than trying to come up with a convoluted explanation for how Matthew and Luke divided Mark between them and knew when to start and when the other one was going to stop and so on, we've got a very clear process that works if Mark was written third. And fantastically, not only does this work at the macro level, the order of the stories in the Gospels, it's also there at the micro level of individual words and phrases. We actually see Mark alternating between the use of Matthew's words and phrases and Luke's words and phrases. And where Mark is following Matthew's order, he follows Matthew's words more closely. Where Mark is following Luke's order, he follows Luke's words more closely. This makes the case for Mark being written first even worse, because now not only do Matthew and Luke have to split Mark's stories between them, they have to go down to the level of individual words. If it was bad enough to have to do this at the story level, now to suggest Matthew and Luke are so carefully splitting Mark's words between them and dividing them up at this level, or that happened by chance, this is not a tenable explanation, especially when there is a clean and simple alternative in which Mark was written third. We've now looked at a number of diagrams. Let's apply some math to this data. I'll be looking at a 1982 paper by Malcolm Lowe in which he called out the demise of arguments from order for Mark and priority, and he relied upon the pericope subdivisions by Joseph Tyson. Using formal logic, he evaluated the proposition that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke as a source, that is, Mark was first, versus the proposition that Mark used Matthew and Luke as sources, that is, Mark was third, and compared the evidence that could be used for each of them. I highly recommend his paper if you'd like to go through the formal logical proof. What he found is, yes, there's plenty of data that is consistent with both of these hypotheses, but any data from the argument from order that is consistent with the expectations if Mark was first will also be consistent with the expectations if Mark was third. So any data that supports this one also supports this one, but the inverse is not true. You can, and we do have data consistent with the expectations if Mark was third that is not consistent with the data if Mark was first. You can have evidence that contradicts Mark being first, that does not contradict Mark being third. Now, what do I mean by the expected order? That is, if this gospel is the source and this gospel is the one using the source, what order do we expect to find the material in the second gospel? Every synoptic theory acknowledges there will be exceptions. But how many exceptions are we talking about? On a 90 pericope count, that is saying that there are 90 stories found in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Depending on how you subdivide the stories, you could come up with a 98 count. It'll change the fractions slightly, but won't do anything to the argument. We'll use a 90 count here. What is the explanatory power of each of these hypotheses? If Mark were first, the data is consistent with what we would expect if Mark were first. 57 times out of 90. The rest are exceptions. All of that data is also consistent with Mark being third. That was one of the great insights by Lowe. Any data that supports this one will support this one, but not the other way around. If Mark's third, the actual data in the gospel supports what we would predict 88 times out of 90. This is incredible. We have a hypothesis with far greater predictive power. Now, some will say, well, Matthew and Luke don't deviate from Mark's order very often. What do we mean not very often? We've got 33 exceptions here. More than a third of the data are exceptions. To suggest that this hypothesis is better than the one that's right 88 times out of 90 sounds to me a bit like special pleading. And we still don't have a good reason why it was so important for Matthew and Luke to try to make sure that always at least one of them was following Mark's order. Given the very complex explanations we had to reach to figure out how this order could emerge if Mark was first, versus a very simple process if Mark was third. Given the explanatory power of the hypothesis that Mark was third, based on the order you would expect to find the material in, I suggest we have a really good case that Mark was written third. Now, some astute observers might say, wait a minute, couldn't you draw a mirror image of all your diagrams and say it was Luke that was first and Matthew that was second? At the level at which we have considered the argument from order, yes, we could. Good observation. If we want to dive more deeply into the argument from order than we have time for right now, we would find that it is more challenging to make the case that Luke was written first. However, we're going to defer our discussion of the relationship between Matthew and Luke for subsequent arguments in this video. The key takeaway from the argument from order is that Mark first is a very convoluted explanation that creates more problems than it solves. Mark third is a remarkably simple and very effective hypothesis. The decisive data point we derive from the argument from order is that we have compelling reason to believe that Mark was the third gospel written. Major argument number 2, the patristic testimony. Patristic referring to early church fathers, early historians who had access to information, volumes of information that we no longer have, and told us some things about the origin of the Gospels. Since we left off with a question on Luke, we'll take just a minute and look at some citations with respect to Luke, and then we'll dive into the patristic citations on Matthew, the focus of this video. The Muratorian fragment, though incomplete, strongly infers that Luke was not the first gospel written, and this is information that probably dates from the 2nd century. Tertullian, a few decades later, in his work against Marcion, wrote extensively on the Gospel of Luke. In his 4th book, in the 2nd and 3rd chapters, he strongly infers that there was a written gospel prior to the Gospel of Luke. And the preface of the Gospel of Luke itself, in the first 4 verses, we're told that this is not the first time somebody has tried to put this material down in writing. So right off the bat, we've got a lot of material suggesting that Luke is probably not first. But what does the patristic testimony tell us about Matthew? Let's start with Irenaeus of Lyon, an extremely important 2nd century source who's just one link removed from apostolic testimony. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. Irenaeus is our earliest source for a whole laundry list of facts about Christian history. He was considered very important by subsequent historians, and his work was referenced as authoritative for centuries in doctrinal disputes. Irenaeus does not tell us explicitly which gospel was written first, although he does tell us that John was written last. However, Irenaeus does drop a number of hints that Matthew was first. In fact, throughout his work, he will frequently cite all 4 Gospels in making a point. And except where he's citing a source and using the order of material from that source, he always puts Matthew first. He's clear that John is last, Mark and Luke will swap places between second and third, suggesting that Irenaeus may not know whether Mark or Luke was second, but he's quite a bit more confident in putting Matthew first. This suggests that at this early date, Matthew was thought of as the primary source. Next, let's turn to Clement of Alexandria. We referenced him briefly in our discussion earlier of the two-gospel hypothesis. Clement was an extraordinarily well-read man, a younger contemporary of Irenaeus, who had the opportunity to learn under the tutelage of the great theologian Pantaenus. Clement told us that the Gospels with the genealogies were written first. He proceeded to give an account of the origin of the Gospel of Mark and told us a little bit about John as well. Despite the fact that people have tried to do cartwheels around the obvious meaning of the Gospels with the genealogies, there are only two Gospels with genealogies that fit the context, and the four-Gospel canon was well known in Clement's time. The most obvious meaning of Clement's statement is that Matthew and Luke were written prior to Mark. Now, we've looked at a number of sources that give us strong leanings but nothing unequivocal. Let's go ahead and hit the nail right on the head. Origen of Alexandria, a man we introduced previously as a scholar's scholar who could mop the floor with any professor alive today in a debate about early Christian history. This is a man who had an encyclopedic knowledge, a pupil of Clement of Alexandria, in fact, who stood at the pinnacle of early Christian scholarship. Origen is unambiguous. Matthew was written first. No equivocation. Eusebius, the father of church history, who had access to a library modern scholars would die just to spend a day in, is likewise unequivocal. He backs Origen up 100% on this point. Matthew was written first. The great scholars, historians, and theologians of the next two generations are likewise unequivocal. Epiphanius, Jerome, Augustine, and more are unequivocal. Matthew was written first. We've just gone through a list of arguably the biggest heavyweights of early Christian history, and we find not one single voice opposing this statement. Matthew's gospel was written first. This is incredible multiple attestation. And we can't just blame it all on Papias and say, oh, well, they misunderstood what he said. We do not have a scrap of evidence from Papias, not even an allusion to Papias, suggesting that this information came from him. If this were anything but poor, tortured New Testament studies, this would be case closed. Matthew was written first. We have incredible, widespread multiple attestation and incredible geographic dispersion of that evidence as well. We've got the empire covered north, south, east, and west, all the way from the Holy Land in one corner to Gaul up near the other, multiple cities in North Africa, Rome, Salamis, and more. Heavyweight scholars who rarely agreed altogether on anything all support this claim that Matthew was written first. This is incredible historical documentation, and it's inconvenient for the preferred theories of many today, and so it is often set aside or altogether ignored. I suggest we can do better. Major argument number 3. Matthew was simultaneously the most Jewish gospel and the most popular gospel in the early church. Its popularity is readily apparent upon a survey of the usage and citation of the Gospels by the early church. Matthew is used by far the most. Edouard Masseau, in his great work on the role of the Gospel of Matthew in the early church, speaking of the 2nd century, observed that more so than any other New Testament document, it was the Gospel of Matthew whose influence was the most widespread and the most profound. The Gospel of Matthew occupied a position of prominence in the early church far and away beyond that of Mark, Luke, and John. The Jewish nature of Matthew shows up right away. In the very first chapter, we are given Jesus' credentials as an heir of David. Matthew makes frequent use of the Old Testament, not just through citations, but also in showing how its prophecies have been fulfilled. A principal theme of the Gospel of Matthew is that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah who came in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Bernard Orchard compiled a list of conspicuously Jewish features of the Gospel of Matthew. I'll cite a few of them here. It makes conscious connection between the Old Testament and the New. The focus on the law of Moses and temple ritual. The Gospel of Matthew expects its readers to be familiar with the views and customs of the groups named as the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and the Sadducees. It never tells us who they are. The audience is expected to already know. And finally, The Gospel of Matthew expects its readers to recognize the tension that would exist among these groups, the Jewish people in general, and the teachings of Jesus. There is a strong implied knowledge of Judaism on the part of the intended audience of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's not just writing to people who are familiar with Judaism, but to people who are familiar with late Second Temple Judaism of the very place in which Jesus' ministry occurred. Why do I emphasize these 2 points? The popularity and the Jewish nature of Matthew's Gospel. So what? These 2 points are in tension with each other. You would not expect both of them to be true. Why is the Jewish gospel the most popular gospel in a Gentile church? True, Christianity sprang out of Judaism, but already by the 2nd generation it was becoming a predominantly Gentile movement. This was pushed along even further by events like the Christian departure from Jerusalem in the 60s AD, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the year 70, and the deaths of a number of prominent early Christian leaders. The paradox then is this: why is the gospel that refers to Gentiles as dogs, the gospel that says that Jesus can't teach the Gentiles, he's just here for the house of Israel, why is the Jewish-focused Gospel of Matthew the most prominent gospel in a Gentile church? If the skeptics had their say, they would even have us believe that the Gospel of Matthew was not written until the 80s or even 90s AD. This is historically implausible. This is the very time frame in which Christianity and Judaism are going through their final, painful separation into clearly distinct religions. Christians are being cast out of synagogues and having anathemas written against them. The Jews are undergoing great persecution at this time as well. This is one of the worst possible times to expect a monumental Jewish gospel to be written and then spread like wildfire across the empire via a Gentile church, and all of that in only a few short years. Yet the skeptics want us to believe that that is exactly what happened. This is historical deception. I find it intriguing that skeptics who claim that we should be disbelieving of virtually everything would have us blindly believe this convoluted history. Skeptical scholars have even invented a hypothetical community or communities for which we don't have historical evidence to explain how this Jewish gospel could have been written at so unlikely a time. It's said to be a somewhat isolated, insulated community of Jewish Christians who are disconnected enough from most of Christianity and most of Judaism that they're somewhat removed from the worst of the friction between Christianity in general and Judaism in general at this time. We'll say that they wrote this gospel. It's bad enough to have to invent an imaginary community to explain how the document was written. And even then we can't explain how this marginal community had its gospel, remember they're kind of isolated, had its gospel spread so widely, so popularly, and so incredibly fast. This is a good argument against the priority of the Gospel of Mark. If Mark was written first, and for a time, some would say for a very extended period of time, was the only written gospel, then we would reasonably expect that the Gentile Christian leaders who grew up at that time, who grew up in the faith of the words of the ministry of their master as recorded in the Gospel of Mark, would hold this gospel in very high esteem and a place of great prominence. And yet that is exactly what we do not see at any point in the early history of the church. The Gospel of Mark is often set aside. It's almost the forgotten gospel. This is an even better argument against the priority of the Gospel of Luke, because here we can't even say, well, maybe people liked Matthew better than Mark because of Matthew's better Greek. The Greek of Luke is better than that of Matthew. If Luke had first mover advantage, the articulate, thorough, well-written, Gentile-facing Gospel of Luke was not about to be rapidly deposed by a Jewish gospel in a Gentile church against the backdrop of the political and social realities of the time. The Christians learned from the Jews how to treasure and revere their sacred texts. Many Christians were willing to die for what these documents said, and some did. To expect that Christian leaders who held the principles of their faith that dear would readily set aside any and all written records they had of the ministry of their master in favor of a gospel written from the perspective of the very group of people who were casting them out defies reason. This is not how human nature works, and this is not how people treat something they profoundly treasure. Rather than trying to rewrite history, to make it conform to the view that Matthew was written so late in the first century and spread so far and so fast at the very time that Christianity and Judaism were decisively separating, I suggest a simpler solution, one that is consistent with actual documented history. I suggest that the Gospel of Matthew was able to occupy such a prominent position in the early church because it got to that position before Christianity separated from Judaism. Matthew is trying to tell people, you can be a good Jew and believe in Jesus. In fact, he goes further than that. He suggests that if you are a good Jew and believe the Old Testament, you should believe in Jesus because the Old Testament prophesied of him. This is a very relevant message in the earliest years of the church when it is predominantly Jewish. It becomes less relevant as time goes on. With Matthew in this proper context, no chronological gymnastics are needed. You have the Jewish gospel written first, when the church is largely Jewish. You have the Gentile gospels of Mark and Luke written later, as the church becomes more Gentile in composition. We've got to give these authors some credit. They were writing with the audiences of their time in mind. This leaves us with a disarmingly simple conclusion. No smoke and mirrors, no frauds and forgeries, no hypothetical documents or communities. The early church treated the Gospel of Matthew as the primary source because it was the primary source. Matthew did not mysteriously supplant the first gospel. It was the first gospel. We have now reviewed three major arguments that Matthew's gospel was written first: the argument from order, the patristic testimony, and the simultaneous role of Matthew as the most Jewish and the most popular gospel in the early church. From these arguments, we have positive evidence that Mark, among the Synoptic Gospels, was written third, and positive evidence that Luke was not written first. From these two premises, we can show deductively that Matthew was written first. Separately, we also have direct positive evidence that Matthew was written first. Each of these three arguments are independent of the others. None of them are circular. Two of the three arguments provide non-reversible evidence that Luke was written after Matthew, and all three provide non-reversible evidence that Mark was written after Matthew. I find the conjunction of these arguments, particularly in the absence of a persuasive case for the priority of Mark or Luke, to be compelling evidence to believe that Matthew was the first gospel written. We'll now take a look at three minor arguments for Matthean priority. I suggest that these arguments do not carry the same weight as the three major arguments considered previously, but they are consistent with Matthean priority, and they show that Matthean priority continues to be consistent with a wide variety of evidence. Minor argument number one: the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark. Over the course of the many stories or pericopes that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all contain, there are literally hundreds of examples where Matthew and Luke share a minor detail that's not in Mark. If Mark wrote first, this would mean that both Matthew and Luke made the same change to their source in exactly the same place, not once or twice, but hundreds of times. If that isn't a stretch enough, the two-source hypothesis would have us believe that this happened entirely by coincidence, because they say that Matthew did not know Luke's work, nor did Luke know Matthew's work. Attempts to explain this by Mark-Q overlap have led to what, in my view, are convoluted attempts to redefine Q. The more that Q begins to look like the Gospel of Matthew, the less need there is to believe that Q even existed in the first place. Imagine it. You give a story to two different people, you have them work independently, and you tell them, copy the story and make some tweaks to it. And they come back with hundreds of identical changes. You're going to believe there was some collaboration or collusion. I suggest that this is devastating evidence against the two-source or two-document hypothesis. However, there's no difficulty if Matthew wrote first and Luke used Matthew as his primary source. I list this in the minor argument section not because I believe the data is minor, it's actually quite substantial, but because I recognize that with some imagination, this is consistent with the Mark without Q hypothesis. If, for example, Mark wrote first, then Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Mark and Matthew, you could get this data. It would involve some strange behavior by Luke, but it's at least possible. I suggest that the simpler solution, requiring fewer assumptions, Occam's razor here, would be that Matthew wrote first, and Luke used Matthew as his primary source. Minor argument number two, patterns in word choice. We've seen this one before. This is where people look for favorite words and phrases of one author and try to find them in the right places in the writings of another gospel author to see if maybe they were borrowed. Studies have produced a variety of results, and as David Barrett Peabody would suggest, many of these studies presupposed Markan priority, thus cutting into their value as a proof for Markan priority. We noted the exception of the work of Edward Zeller, who did not presuppose a solution to the synoptic problem, and as a result, in the minds of many, his work is particularly significant. Zeller provided strong quantitative evidence that Mark borrowed from Matthew and Mark borrowed from Luke, not the other way around. Additionally, one other study worth noting is that by C.S. Mann. Now, we do have to acknowledge right off the bat that C.S. Mann did presuppose Matthean priority. The reason I do think his data is still worth considering is the high bar he set for what counted as evidence. His intent was to restrict his search only to places where it was actually possible that one author borrowed from the other, and then only consider words that show up 3 times as often or more in one gospel versus another. If it's just a little bit more often in this gospel than that one, we're not going to say that's a clear example of borrowing, but where we've got 3 times the frequency of a word's usage in one gospel versus another, there's a better chance that that's a favorite word or phrase of this gospel author. On the basis of that higher bar he set, Mann had overwhelming quantitative evidence that it was Mark who borrowed from Matthew. Minor argument number 3, the metaphor of the stained glass window. Imagine you're shown 2 photographs of the same stained glass window. In one photograph, the window is intact, it's complete, it's a masterpiece. In the other, the glass is in shards and fragments on the ground, below the frame which is bent, and there's a big rock on the ground next to the broken glass. The photographs do not come with timestamps on them, and you'd like to know which one was taken first. Now, theoretically, it's possible either could have been taken first. It is possible, with great time and expense, to restore a broken stained glass window so well, it's not apparent that it's a restoration. But it's far more plausible, it requires fewer assumptions, for which we don't have data, to suggest that the first photograph is the one of the intact window, and then somebody threw a rock through it. In considering the relationship between Matthew and Luke, what we find is that Matthew's sermons are these magisterial stained glass window compositions, whereas in Luke's gospel, a lot of the same data is there, but he breaks it up in pieces, scattered throughout his gospel. This is not to argue, well, which one is the correct order of the material. Neither author was trying to organize all of their material strictly chronologically. It appears that much of Matthew's material is organized by topic, and much of Luke's material is organized by geography, and we should expect that an itinerant preacher like Jesus probably gave the same sermon in different levels of detail more than once. But if either Matthew borrowed from Luke or Luke borrowed from Matthew, which is more likely? Now, I suppose it's possible that Matthew went slavishly through Luke or Luke's source and found little pieces here, there, and everywhere, and stitched them all together, and voila, a masterpiece emerged. Possible, but I suggest it's far more plausible that the carefully constructed sermons came first, and that it was Luke who took pieces of them and used them in various places. Either is possible, one is far more plausible. We could also make a similar, though not identical argument. In examining Matthew's alleged use of Mark and Q as sources, we would run into some similar difficulties. As we've considered the 3 minor arguments, we found another heavy blow against the popular 2-source hypothesis. We've seen additional quantitative data suggesting Matthew did not use Mark, and we've seen an independent argument suggesting it's very unlikely that Matthew used Luke as a source. I don't think any of these 3 arguments get Matthean priority across the finish line on their own, but what we do see is the continued accumulation of evidence that is challenging to explain on the popular view, but presents no difficulty if Matthew wrote first. Finally, let's take a look at the abductive argument. Abductive reasoning is a form of logic that makes an inference to the best explanation. It's often used in the sciences when considering an event that occurred in the past that cannot be directly observed. We look at a variety of competing hypotheses and ask which can best account for the data. The 4 forms of reasoning, deductive, inductive, reductive, and abductive, are useful for answering different kinds of questions. And abductive reasoning can be particularly useful in a study of history. How do we apply abductive reasoning to the synoptic problem? In the second video, in the Who, When, and Why series, we looked at 10 major categories of evidence that a solid theory on the synoptic problem should be able to account for. None of the major theories on the synoptic problem today can account for each of these 10 categories of evidence. In fact, even with bells and whistles and special pleading built on top, they still can't account for all of this evidence. In the next video in the Who, When, and Why series, I will propose a solution to the synoptic problem that is not only remarkably simple, but can account for each of these 10 categories of evidence. This, then, would be the solution favored by an abductive argument because it can explain more of the data than can competing hypotheses. There is internal and external evidence to be considered. Unfortunately, many have set aside much of the external evidence because it is difficult to pair with the internal evidence that they prefer. Some would have the unanimous testimony of the early church be solely dependent on one erroneous source. Where is this early source? Where is this ubiquitous and incredibly influential source never named in any surviving document? Where is this source? It exists in the imagination. We will find in the next video that it is possible to pair the internal and external evidence. Because this proposed solution will rely on Matthean priority, we have another case for Matthean priority, an abductive case. Matthean priority allows us to lay the foundation for the best explanation of the evidence. In conclusion, we've looked at 3 major arguments and 3 minor arguments for Matthean priority. On the basis of these 6 arguments, I suggest it is reasonable to conclude that Matthew's Gospel was written first. Then we took a forward-looking argument, the abductive argument, and said, if we accept that Matthew was first, at least for sake of argument, and build a synoptic solution on top of that, can we produce an explanation that better explains the data than do competing hypotheses? That is the question to which we will turn our attention next. And I suggest that the hypothesis that Matthew was written first is the hypothesis with the greatest explanatory power.